Ô notre Dieu et Créateur, nous vous remercions de cette belle journée et de ce magnifique pays que vous nous avez donné. Nous vous prions de nous accorder la sagesse nécessaire pour mieux œuvrer pour toute notre population, pour adresser leurs rêves, leurs ambitions. Nous vous prions de bénir cette assemblée et de porter confort à tous ceux qui sont dans le besoin, qui souffrent et le désespoir. Et nous vous demandons d'éclairer le chemin pour que nous puissions adresser ces personnes et créer un meilleur avenir pour tout notre territoire. En votre nom, Seigneur, nous demandons. Amen.
Please be seated. Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, the expansion and growth of the Northwest Territories manufacturing sector offers a means to diversify the economy and encourage greater economic development and investment. For that reason, our government has committed to developing a northern manufacturing strategy in collaboration with industry and the Northwest Territories Manufacturers Association. In this government's mandate, we have committed to developing a Northwest Territories manufacturing strategy that will expand our territory's manufacturing sector, identify areas of potential growth, promote and market N.W.T manufactured products, and aid in the professional and technological advancements of manufacturing in the Northwest Territories. The development of this strategy is being guided by research and engagement with existing manufacturers, prospective manufacturers, key stakeholders, and the public. The department investigated the market factors that point to what needs to be done. Dialogues, public engagement sessions, and industry meetings has given us an understanding of what stakeholders want to do, and facility tours and industry meetings have demonstrated what can be done. Over the past few months, ITI's project team hosted 11 public sessions and an additional 60 stakeholder engagements, talking face-to-face with as many as 174 individuals about manufacturing in the Northwest Territories. A web-based engagement portal was also used to gather feedback from those who were unable to attend engagement opportunities in person. The website was accessed 262 times, and follow-up communications were conducted by phone or by email. Mr. Speaker, the findings of our meetings and engagements will be formally captured in a What We Heard report that will be released in April. It will offer an understanding of challenges, ideas, and opportunities raised by N.W.T residents, manufacturers, and stakeholders. Many of the discussions addressed on the common challenges of working and operating a business in the North, freight and utility costs in particular, are impinging on our manufacturers. Staff recruitment, training, and retention were also identified as challenges. As expected, our government's procurement policies and practices were a topic of much discussion. We recognize that more communication and clarity will be needed in this area. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we heard that we need to increase markets outside the government for products manufactured in the Northwest Territories and develop supports for N.W.T manufacturing beyond its existing northern manufacturing policy. Mr. Speaker, our engagement process will generally inform our strategy's development. In addition to identifying the challenges, issues, and concerns of the Northwest Territories manufacturing sector, our conversations and meetings have confirmed the opportunities and strengths on which we will now build and move forward. I look forward to sharing a draft of the Northwest Territories' new N.W.T manufacturing strategy with members in time for our May-June session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Let's see. Minister's statement. Minister, you can go down in the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories has made a commitment in its mandate to support our seniors to live in their own homes for as long as possible while ensuring adequate supports when they can no longer do so. I'd like to provide an update on our continued efforts to make this commitment a reality. As members know, the government put in place a strategic framework, Our Elders, Our Communities, which supports a comprehensive approach to meeting the needs of our seniors. Current work related to the 7 priorities in this framework is ongoing and includes planning for future long-term care beds in Yellowknife, Hay River, and Nunavut, planning for extended care beds in alignment with the timelines of the Stanton Renewal Project, supporting Health and Social Services Authority with training on supportive pathways approach, supporting authority staff to attend Elders in Motion training, collaborating with authorities on policies to support implementation of the new continuing care standards, planning to pilot tools developed with the N.W.T Senior Society to screen for elder abuse, and collaborating with the N.W.T Senior Society to validate tools and the approach to support early integration and palliative care. We are also making progress on activities outlined in our Continuing Care Services Action Plan. Research and analysis for the paid family community caregiver option pilot is currently underway in order to identify the needs of seniors, adults with disabilities, as well as their caregivers. We want to empower our seniors by allowing them to decide who they want to assist them with their unmet care needs. This type of program will be of particular importance in our smaller Indigenous communities where the resources are limited, connection to family is strong, and aging in place is favored. The federal investment of $890,000 to the program over the next 4 years will undoubtedly aid in its overall success. Mr. Speaker, the Department is advancing work of the Yellowknife Adult Day program. A thorough review of the Avon's Elder Day program was conducted in 2017, which informed the need for adult day programming in Yellowknife. A request for a proposal was issued earlier this winter. The Department is working closely with the Yellowknife region of the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority to reestablish an adult day services for seniors in the City of Yellowknife. A few months ago, we released the 6th edition of the Seniors Information Handbook. This resource provides a comprehensive list of the programs and services the seniors and their caregivers can access to make informed decisions about their care. We distributed this handbook in a widespread mail-out across the Northwest Territories and continue to receive requests for copies to this day. We are proud of this resource and thankful to all of the partners who contributed to its completion. I'm also pleased that officials of the government have begun working with the N.W.T Senior Society to develop a report card on N.W.T programs and services for seniors. The report card is an opportunity to inventory and assess the effectiveness of N.W.T programs and services either designed for or accessed by seniors, determine how well they're meeting the seniors' needs, and identify areas for potential improvement or better coordination. The first steps are to draft the terms of reference for this project, to start an inventory of all programs and services for seniors across government, and begin an assessment of the effectiveness of these programs and services in order to identify areas for improvement. Mr. Speaker, knowing that the number of adults over the age of 70 will nearly triple by 2034, we are making significant strides to ensure our elders can age safely in their homes with dignity while surrounded by family. This issue will remain at the forefront of the N.W.T priorities as we strive for the best care, best health, and best future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statement. Member from the N.W.T.
Q90, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with new money rolling in from the Canadian Heritage to revitalize, preserve, and enhance official languages, Indigenous languages, this funding is imperative to the survival of our languages and culture that have been undergoing pattern of decline. It is my hope that the Northwest Territories will have a success story about the language revival and become an example for the rest of the country to follow. Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons why linguistic heritage is often in danger of extinguishment is because of colonialism and the treatment of non-dominant languages and culture being rendered invisible. The fate of our languages can be drastically changed by simply by the fact that children no longer learn them. One way we can help language revival is to teach children from an early age. Who better to teach them than our elders, who are some of the greatest teachers of our society. An example is possibly having daycares in the same buildings or streets as homes for elders and include elders and children's engagement in the daily schedules of activities. Mr. Speakers, elders hold valuable knowledge and wisdom in all topics of life. They have valuable talents, skills, and expertise that are so relevant today. Elders are some of the most concerned when it comes to youth, children, and families. Mr. Speaker, elders are keen observers of their environment, offering us guidance and awareness that help our communities. Throughout various colonialization forces, our elders remain filled with hope, faith, and humor intact, which tell the rest of us something about the power and validity of traditional teachings, healings, and resilience. Mr. Speaker, we must take care of our elders, not only because they need us, but because we also need them. Mr. Speaker, we must promote our elders to socially include them with family, friends, and organizations in their communities. If we empower our elders in this way, elders are able to fulfill their intergenerational roles in transferring their knowledge and traditions to the next generation, which would help them be more active and effective in teaching, maintaining, preserving our cultures, traditions, and way of life. Mr. Speaker, it's crucial to involve our elders in all areas where they can meaningfully participate in intergenerational relationships, especially when it comes to children and the revival of their mother tongue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as you've heard, the Nehende region has dealt with a number of tragic deaths in the past year. We've had a lot of people working on helping the residents deal with this matter. Last June, the Detroit Divisional Education Council trustees directed the staff to plan a conference around the theme of mental health. This is one way to respond to the sixth suicide in the past 6 months, a young woman from the community of Fort Simpson. There was a concern that our youth needed more information on how to live healthy lives and make positive choices. A conference was determined to be one of the starting points for educating our youth and leading into substantial follow-up in the area of mental well-being. The council staff worked with representatives from Municipal and Community Affairs, Health and Social Services, and Littleco First Nation to work on organizing the conference this past February in Fort Simpson. The theme, Living Well for Oneself, evolved in response to the student survey on what they would like to know and do, as well incorporated some of the direction from youth who met over this past summer. The two-day sessions were organized as a conference-like format with a focus on mental wellness. In the evening, there were various recreational activities from sport and traditional games to yoga and meditation, as well as various arts. Quiet areas were set up in the school, including open studios for those wanting to decompress using an art medium. A much music event on Wednesday night was followed by two much music motivation presentations on Thursday morning for conference participants and WAMPUS students. The conference was attended by 189 students from grade 7 to 12 from all the 8 Detroit communities. They were able to provide strategies to support students to deal with mental health issues and to develop and maintain a healthy, balanced life. Conference organizers felt that they had strong partnership and buy-in from all organizations and a strong direction to move forward. I'd like to share a couple of comments from the youth who responded to the following question. What one or two messages were important to you? Mental health is a serious topic. Never be ashamed of what and who you are. Believe in yourself. You're not alone. They had 28 students complete this section, asking them to identify themselves if they needed to talk to anyone. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the one saying it takes a community to raise a child is so true. However, I'd like to take it one step further and say it takes the region and territories to help our youth grow. From the bottom of my heart, I'd like to thank the organizations, the government, and the youth for an excellent first start. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, the member Decho.
Mr. Speaker, can you feel it? Can you hear it? Mr. Speaker, the Outer Winter Games are fast approaching, and the opening ceremony of the 2018 South Slave Games is taking place this Sunday, March 18 in Hay River. Hay River is the traditional territory of the N.W.T First Nations, along with the West Point First Nation and the Métis Nation. While part of the games will also be held in Fort Smith, the Denny Games will take place on the Hay River Reserve. I look forward to the cultural events such as stick pole, snow stake, snake, hand games, and drum dances. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge some of the athletes and coaches from the Detroit riding. Beth Hudson from Fort Providence is Team N.W.T's coach for table tennis. Catherine Lenore from Enterprise is a curler in the junior team. And finally, Shannon Bonrouge from Fort Providence is the territorial champion and will be competing as a junior table tennis athlete. I also like to recognize the many people that made this possible in the town of Hay River and Fort Smith, the parents and the cheerleaders that will be cheering on their favorite team and players. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that the Detroit will be represented at the Arctic Winter Games and will be rooting for Team N.W.T. Best of luck to our athletes. They are our future Olympians in the making. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Best of luck to all athletes for Northwest Territories. Member statement. Member Ike Godin, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can you feel it? Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of athletes that are excited to be travelling this weekend to participate in the Arctic Winter Games in Hay River and Fort Smith. Mr. Speaker, athletes have worked countless hours preparing, training, and focusing on achieving in their sport to get to this level of competition. I wish to congratulate all athletes. These games are going to be memorable as they go out and compete, making N.W.T proud of their accomplishments. They'll make new friends, see different territories, provinces, and different countries participating and enjoying the extracurricular activities that Hay River and Fort Smith have to offer. Mr. Speaker, I commend the community supporters, parents, and coaches that have helped get their athletes to the Arctic Winter Games. I also want to recognize athletes from the Mackenzie Delta riding who will be participating. Kendall Archie, Arctic Sports, Keegan Airy, Denny Games, Logan Airy, Denny Games, Monica Airy, Denny Games, Frank Alanik, Denny Games, Annie Ergak Tuak, Denny Games, Morris Blake, Denny Games, Madison McLeod, Snowshoeing, Ruth Hanthorne, Snowshoeing, Jesse Hanthorne, Snowshoeing, Darby Robert, Snowshoeing, Joe Larry, Snowshoeing, and AJ Charlie for hockey. Good luck, try your best, be proud and play fair. We will be cheering you on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Our government sponsored a disturbing talk at the Association for Mineral Exploration Roundup Conference that took place in Vancouver in January. This talk is still available on the internet. The event was billed as an Indigenous Partnership Breakfast, an event celebrating Indigenous participation in mining and exploration. The speaker from BC said a number of things I've tried to highlight word for word. People want to talk about negotiating treaties. We've been at it for 35 years and should be able to settle it now. Non-Canadian money and non-Canadian interests come into our Aboriginal communities and use First Nations to stop economic development without really looking at our issues. Instead, they promise equal jobs, tourism, green energy futures. Everyone's going to be working, everyone's going to get lots of money, but as soon as they stop an economic development project, they leave town and they are never coming back. These are well-funded organizations that have big offices in Vancouver, big offices in the US and all over the place, but they leave the minute that they stop your project. Your band members receive nothing, maybe a few people get funded, maybe a few of them get cash awards, maybe some of your leaders get rich and from some of these environmental organizations. These environmental organizations divide communities. They put Native against Native in terms of violence, in terms of vandalism, and they know this. They don't care about your community. I'm seeing this all across BC. And also, what they want to do is set up your community to go to court either against their own people, against their own system, against the corporations, against the government. Then they'll just sit by and intervene on a separate topic. But it's all part of their plan to stop the growth of BC and Canada. That's the end of some quotes, Mr. Speaker. It was notable that our Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, in thanking this speaker, said that it's, quote, important for us to push back on the naysayers, end of quote. While I and others in this House enjoy a healthy debate on the future of the N.W.T, for our government to sponsor such inaccurate, divisive and hateful views is very disturbing. I have questions for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment on whether our government shares these views and whether there's any evidence of these non-Canadian environmental organizations in the Northwest Territories or the criminal activities that they are alleged to support or instigate. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike-Godin and the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we wrap up this session and look outside, we see the longer days are returning and the temperatures are slowly warming. Beautiful. Late winter in the N.W.T is a magical time of year. It's a time of renewal and festivity. Here in Yellowknife, some special community events provide an opportunity for that celebration. The Snow Kings' 23rd season is well underway, Mr. Speaker. The festival draws visitors from across Canada and other parts of the world. The amazing castle, under tutelage from Snow King himself, Tony Folio, is built by hand by a hardy group of souls starting right after New Year's. With a courtyard and slide, a grand ballroom, and various nooks and crannies, the Snow Castle has evolved into a masterful thing of beauty. It's a true community treasure. And I want to congratulate another group of dedicated people who are working hard to put another great event on. I'm referring to the board and volunteers who are gearing up for the 7th annual Long John Jamboree. The Jamboree celebrates the best parts of being a winter city. Games on the snow stage, live music in the carnival tent, arts exhibitions, the heritage tent, La Cabana Sucra, the burn on the bay, curling on the lake, and the international ice carving competition have made the Long John Jamboree another winter festival we can all be proud of. In 8 days, the Jamboree will kick off. Organizers and volunteers have been working hard for months, dedicating hours of hard work and creativity to create a winter festival that's accessible, fun, and celebrates our northern traditions. Along with the Jamboree and Snow King, Yellowknife Bay has a never-ending stream of activity in the month of March. That includes one of Yellowknife's longest-standing traditions, the Canadian Championship Dog Derby. There's hockey, kite skiing, ice fishing, and lots more activity, fun, and celebration of the returning of light. Great activities for Northerners and visitors alike to enjoy. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in expressing our congratulations to the many hardworking organizers and volunteers of all our territory's spectacular festivals and jamborees. Celebrations like these make our communities great, and they deserve our support and recognition. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Merci. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Tuna de Wallade.
Give my constituents, elder constituents in my communities a bit of an update on what I'm going to be doing from now until we come back into the House again on May the 24th. And today I'm going to attempt again for the second time to do the majority of my statement in my language.
Today, we have been working hard here, talk about how the work we've been doing here. We've been sitting here now. February 7th we started. March 15th, this is our last day of session. Once we finish here today, well, we'll be meeting again here in the middle of April for one week in April. And then we'll be going to our constituencies for 2 weeks. We'll be talking with social development. And then we'll be going up north to talk to we'll be talking to the people here, our constituents here around the lake. We'll be going to the Slavey country, and we'll be also talking to the people on this side of the lake. We'll be talking about the marijuana issue and talking to the people about it. What the federal government is planning to do. They're saying the marijuana legalization is going to be okay for the people, so they are talking about the different laws that are pertaining to the issue. So half the committee are going to be talking. We'll be meeting back here in one committee, and then we'll be talking to that again. And then I'll be going to my constituents again by myself. Around April 1st, I'll be going to Fort Resolution. After 5 days there, I will be going to Slutselke to complete my visit. Can you feel it? Can you feel it, Mr. Speaker? The Arctic Winter Games is starting in Hay River. All the kids and the elders are all coming together. It's going to be a joyous event. All the MLAs will be going to Hay River for the opening ceremony. May 24th, we'll be meeting again here in session again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godan and the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the parts I found most rewarding about my time as a member of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories has been my involvement with public accounts committees. Public accounts committees have a long tradition stretching back hundreds of years and are a notable feature of the Westminster system, of which our unique form of consensus borrows some of its practices from. Public accounts are where the government's books are looked at after a given fiscal year, and where you can drill down into the details and see how taxpayer money was spent, ensure value for money for taxpayer dollars, and also ensure programs and services are being delivered appropriately. Public accounts committees work closely with supreme audit institutions in Canada and the Northwest Territories. That's the Office of the Auditor General. Mr. Speaker, there are many organizations that work to bring different public accounts committees and members together to have these discussions. In Canada, that's the Canadian Council of Public Accounts Committees, of which the Northwest Territories hosted early on in this term. This provides a forum for good practice sharing and knowledgeable exchange and effective public financial management. I had the pleasure, along with my colleague, the Honourable Member from SAW2, of attending the 2017 Westminster Workshop for Public Accounts and the CAPAC conference from December 4th to December 7th of last year, where I learned, networked, and brought back a whole new skill set that I will retain and utilize for the rest of my career on the Standing Committee of Government Operations and as a parliamentarian. The aim for this workshop was to build skills and capacity of chairs, members, and clerks of Commonwealth public accounts committees to fulfill their remit to scrutinize the value of money of public spending and to hold governments to account for the delivery of public services. The objectives were to deliver key skills, knowledge, and provide peer support and grow the expertise of these committees in promoting tax transparency, preventing tax avoidance, and encourage country-by-country reporting in all legislatures. Mr. Speaker, this conference provided me with valuable information about how we can make our public accounts system better in the Northwest Territories and key contacts with parliamentarians on public accounts committees across the entire Commonwealth. Mr. Speaker, I think this is the exact kind of professional development that parliamentarians need to be able to engage in freely to develop their skills and deliver better value for money analysis for the people of the Northwest Territories. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Colleagues, please allow me to draw your attention to the presence in the gallery today of Mr. Anthony W.J. Whitford. As many of you know, Mr. Whitford is a man of many roles. Former commissioner, former speaker, former minister, former member, former sergeant at arms, honorary clerk at the table, and member of the Order of N.W.T. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Whitford to the House this afternoon. It's always a pleasure to have you in the House. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I, too, want to take this opportunity to recognize Mr. Tony Whitford, resident of the Yellowknife North riding, of course, a man of many accolades and a good family friend. Welcome, and thank you for being here on our final day.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to recognize my constituency system, Mr. Garrett Cochran. This is the last day of session, and he's been invaluable over the last several weeks in helping me prepare for the day's work and helping me keep in touch with my constituents, and I want to take the opportunity to recognize his service. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Tuna-de-Willowday.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize interpreters from Tuna-de-Willowday, Mr. Tom Unka from Fort Resolution, and Rose Sundberg from Deda.
Massey. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in the gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's been some confusion about commissioners' lands and territorial lands in my riding and across the territories when you talk to people. And my questions will be to the Minister of Lands. And my first question is, what is the difference between commissioners' lands and territorial land? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Commissioner's land is primarily land that is located in and around communities. It's managed through policy and regulation under the Commissioner's Land Act. Territorial land is most often the land that's in the more remote regions of the Northwest Territories. In some cases, there are some territorial lands located within communities, but however, that is the exception. These lands are regulated by the Northwest Territories Lands Act and regulations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that clarification. My next question, how does the government come up with an assessment for commissioners' land and territorial land? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The assessed values of commissioners' land parcels is determined by the assessors in MACA's assessment unit, which is a unit independent of the land managers in the Department of Lands. They use an approach that is consistent from community to community across the Northwest Territories to determine the assessed value of each parcel. If the occupant of the parcel disagrees with the assessed value, there are appeal mechanisms through MACA that can be implemented to review the assessment. Territorial land value is determined by an appraised value of land as required by the Northwest Territories land use regulations, which the government commissions from an independent certified appraiser. The appraised value is used because most territorial land is very remote, in very remote areas of the territory, and does not require services such as water, power, and fuel delivery. It's not possible, of course, to assess each parcel, but an appraisal of raw land is completed by the representative across the N.W.T. and applied consistently. So there's two manners in which the values are determined. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. So my next question is, how is commissioners' land and territorial land fees determined / calculated? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department uses the assessed value, which I've described, to calculate the annual lease fee for each commissioner's land parcel. This fee is based on the assessed value of the parcel each year. Some, such as seniors and nonprofit organizations, may be eligible for a 50% discount off the annual lease fee paid on commissioner's land. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. My last question right now is, what is the fees for both commissioners' lands and territorial lands used for? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, that depends on the value of the lands as assessed by the MACA assessment unit. That's with respect to commissioner's land. For an average-sized lot, the cost is often in the area of about $2,000 a year. However, as members will know, we are proposing a reduction from 10% to 5%, and so that $2,000 lease fee would then be reduced to $1,000 per year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. The member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Earlier today, I quoted a speaker sponsored by a government at the recent 2018 Roundup conference. One of his messages was to not waste time on negotiations on treaties or land rights. Can our Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment, who sponsored this talk, tell us whether Cabinet is of the position that negotiations on treaties and land rights are a waste of time? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member knows, that's not our position. Number one priority of this government is land claims and settling outstanding land claims and self-government agreements in the territory. That's a position that the Speaker took. That's his position. We have our position, and we work closely with all Aboriginal governments to move things along. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'm really pleased to hear the Minister say that. This Speaker that was sponsored by our government described environmental organizations as being non-Canadian, well-funded, with large offices in foreign countries that try to divide communities to stop economic development and instigate violence. Can the Minister tell the public whether there's any evidence that any of these organizations operate in the Northwest Territories? And if so, has their criminal activity been reported to the RCMP? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No, I do not believe that we've had those type of activities in Northwest Territories, but what I can tell this House is our government works closely with NGOs on a regular basis. My department in particular has worked very closely with NGOs. In fact, our department is engaged directly with NGOs on natural resource legislation initiatives that we're bringing forward, and we will continue to do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to thank the Minister for that again, that he doesn't share the views of the Speaker, although he sponsored the talk. Our civil society organizations in Northern Canada have made tremendous contributions to our society. Some recent examples include the cooperative work and legal action to uphold the Yukon Umbrella Final Agreement and to protect the Peel Land Use Plan, and the work here in Yellowknife that has resulted in a legally binding oversight and research agreement covering giant mine remediation. Can the Minister tell us whether he recognizes the value and work performed by civil society, including environmental organizations in the Northwest Territories? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is Canada. Everyone gets to have their say. We believe everyone should be engaged in our processes as open and transparent as we can be. I think we're probably more open and transparent than any government in Canada, and we will continue to move on that. We're always open to all kinds of comments, no matter if it's legislation or public policy or what we're moving forward, but we're always open. We're not saying that criticism is a bad thing. Sometimes we need reflection on some of what we're doing, and we take all comments seriously. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My last question for the Minister. I stated earlier today that it's my view it's very disturbing that our government would sponsor this individual to give such an inaccurate, divisive and hateful account of civil society. And I wonder whether this is something that we can expect from our government in the future. So I'd like to know from the Minister whether it's the intention of our government to continue to sponsor such misinformation or whether we can expect a more balanced approach in the future. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This individual that we had speaking at this event is someone I think that has an opinion. He had an opinion. He brought his opinion to us, but let's make something quite clear. This is an Indigenous person. He was an Indigenous leader in BC of an Indigenous government. He's in public government. He was a cabinet minister, and now he's an MLA within the BC legislature. He brought his views to the table around industry and development and tried to get his people out of poverty and have an economy in his reserve, in his area, and his comments were taken. And in fact, the member says if we'd like to open up our views to be wide open, I'd like to ask the member if he'd like maybe to speak at Roundup next year at one of our events. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Canada, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a few things that I'm really passionate about. Education is one of them, and that's why I always tell the young people that makes me sound old, but I always tell the young people that we have great student financial assistance in the territory, and it's gotten better recently with their Bring It North initiative, which rewards people for coming back to the North, or even if you weren't from the North, moving here. It helps with student loans. But recently, a lot of people started receiving their T4A slips for one of the initiatives, the Northern Bonus, and I've gotten some questions on it. And people are worried that well, they're not worried, but I mean, they're a little concerned that this is something they're going to be taxed on. This loan remission is something they're going to be taxed on. So I'd like some clarification from the minister. Is this T4A that the students are receiving from the Department of Education a taxable item? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I believe our program has a lot of incentives for our students. We do have a forgiveness loan. We also have 0% interest on loans. And the Northern Bonus, as the member alluded to. And Mr. Speaker, because the Northern Bonus is classified as a grant, therefore it is a taxable benefit, and recipients are issued actually a T4A slip. I want to let the member know that our government, our department is currently reviewing this program, the Northern Bonus program, and to determine if there is any alternative ways to provide this benefit without the tax implication on the student. For members, the Northern Bonus is to try to bring students to the Northwest Territories, and they're allotted up to $2,000 per year to pay off their student's loan to a lifetime maximum of $10,000. And as I said, we'll be reviewing the specific Northern Bonus program to see if there's any changes that we can do to make it to include it without a tax implication. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidder Cassie member, Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad the department is taking that step to look at this, and I understand maybe why it rolled out like this, because this is even offered to people who aren't from the territory, who didn't get SFA, who may have gotten other student loans. So I can see maybe why this happened. Does the minister have an idea if this might be changed for the upcoming year? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned, we are currently reviewing this Northern Bonus program. Once we get the results and that review complete, I will share it with members, and most likely will be put up on our website as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Ikere Canada member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe it's crucial to involve elders in all areas where they can meaningfully participate in intergenerational relationships. Research has shown that these interactions can have benefits for each generation. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment. Mr. Speaker, does the N.W.T have anything formal in offering interactions between elders and college students, school children, and children of other ages in a variety of settings to promote and consistently expose them to language and culture? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, our JK to 12 education system is based on the goal of ensuring that all students are grounded in the rich and diverse history, culture, language, and heritage of our peoples in the Northwest Territories. As you know, we do fund all of our Indigenous governments that play an integral part in working with our schools and in the classrooms. We do have the Elders in the Schools program. We're currently revising our Aboriginal languages curriculum, indigenizing education, and we always promote to our schools to ensure that our elders are in fact participating on the land activities as well. We also hire some of our elders as language instructors, cultural resource experts, and at any opportunity allow them to come into the schools. In terms of early childhood development, as I mentioned, we do offer to the tune of about $4.8 million to Indigenous governments, and one of the great programs that they do have is an Indigenous language nests programming that ensures children in early childhood development settings are surrounded by their Indigenous languages, as well as working with some of the elders in the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nakira Cassie, member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's good information for the rest of the territory to hear. Mr. Speaker, elders are not just passive recipients of care. They are resourceful individuals with great achievements and skills in their roster. Mr. Speaker, can the minister look into any possibility of combining daycare for children and elders to further enhance Indigenous language and culture and exposure with early childhood development, working with the Minister of Health and Social Services to bring elders and youth together in elders' homes, daycares across the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department does not operate early child care programs in the N.W.T. However, the department does license, and we also fund non-for-profit organizations who administer early childhood programs and centers as such. Under the child daycare standards, regulations require licensed early childhood programs to engage in community involvement, which would include connecting with community elders. As I mentioned, elder participation is highly encouraged in all forms of education, right from early childhood to post-secondary. And I know that in some cases, elders work with some of the daycares and schools in terms of teaching traditional skills, sewing, culture camps, language instructions, storytelling even. And in our unique small communities, it's a lot easier for our elders and our youth to get together on more of a regular basis, and we do promote that and encourage that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Trinity Willady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Minister of the Housing Corporation some questions on the new program, a fuel tank program. I think that's a very good program. It's good for the environment, very good for even insurance purposes. I'd like to ask the Minister if in communities where there most of the heavy materials brought in by barge, if the Minister could in advance in communities that are barged in, and particularly Toots-Alkef, of course for my riding, if the Housing Corporation would send in several tanks into Toots-Alkef in preparation to exchange the tanks sometime as the current tanks begin to fail. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I will take that into consideration. It's important to learn from programs that we've offered in the past and see how we can make them better. We did learn through housing that we need to work with the communities that don't have all-season roads and be more proactive. So we will look at barging in fuel tanks to those communities that don't have access through the all-season road. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Trinity Willady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in many of the communities, we don't have private tradespeople. So I'd like to ask the Minister, in situations where there may be an inventory of tanks and we have a tank failure that's urgent or an emergency situation, if the Minister can work through the system and have the housing authority maintenance staff change the tanks at the community level. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we would have to do a community-by-community view. I think that we are looking at seeing how the local housing authorities can support their communities better, recognizing that they don't have available supplies, contractors, etc., for a variety of housing needs. So we are looking at that. I do have to make sure before I make a commitment in the House, though, that if we're going to be doing that, my thinking is, and I may be wrong, is that you need to have some kind of certification to be able to do that. So I need to make sure that either the local housing authorities have that certification or we have some means to provide that certification. Thank you. But I do commit that we are trying to look at how to address the needs of all homeowners within communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Council Member Trinity Willady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the main things that the Housing Corporation is trying to prevent with the new program is obviously a potential for huge environmental disasters. We've seen situations where we have leaking tanks that cost $250,000 to remediate because it takes quite a hole to get the fuel out of the ground. So I'd like to ask the minister if, in my case, there's hardly anyone, I should say, that can afford to actually pay for the cost of full remediation if they have a complete failure with their fuel tank. Therefore, I mean, it could involve moving a home and so on and so forth. I'd like to ask the minister if the minister would have discussions with the Department of Environment and Natural Resources to see if the government can pay for such a disaster. Thank you.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is correct. We are looking at being proactive and to try to alleviate the need for huge environmental costs when fuel tanks leak. It's not only a cost issue, it's an environmental issue that we're trying to address. I can't speak on behalf of other departments, but I can say that I will direct the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation to touch base to try to work with ENR to actually see how we can address any fuel tank spills as best as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. No dire Cassie member Tuna de Wolde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the minister for that response. Mr. Speaker, we have situations where individuals are beginning to discover the reason why they have the program, and that's because those older tanks do fail after a certain number of years. I'd like to ask the minister if the minister could look at a possibility of helping individuals out where there is no tank in the community to install, and they have a leak. So it will take potentially a couple of weeks because most likely in situations like Hutsalkay, you'd have to fly the tank in. So if the N.W.T. Housing Corporation could work with the local housing authority to maybe do something in the interim to stop the leak until the new tank can be delivered to the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
See. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm willing to work with the communities on this, but I can't do this alone. So if homeowners actually have an issue where they have an environmental concern, they don't have a fuel tank, or they may be having to take one out because it's not meeting the need now and we can't get a tank in there, then if they apply to the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation, we will try to do our best to try to alleviate any potential or spillage that is there currently, recognizing that they have to fit within the needs assessment, the income threshold to be able to qualify for our programming. But tell people if they have an issue, apply, because if you don't apply, if you don't let us know, then we can't provide any services. So anyone that has an issue, apply and see if we can support them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of questions for the Minister responsible for Health and Social Services. Mr. Speaker, during my constituency meeting, the elder brought up the need for sending elders to Inuvik during spring breakup and freeze-up, as we have a couple elders in the community with serious health issues. So I'd like to ask the Minister, will the Minister and his department send elders with health issues to Inuvik for spring breakup and freeze-up? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Sigijik is unique in the fact that it doesn't have an airport, so if we did have an issue, medevacs are certainly more complicated. They certainly may be more expensive as a result of having to use a helicopter. We do try to provide additional support during freeze-up or breakup by having a nurse in the community during those periods of time. But I do hear the member. I would say that anything that we do would have to be on a case-by-case basis, and it would have to be determined based on risk, the issue that the senior have. I wouldn't say that every senior would have to be removed, but those with complicated conditions that are at risk, we may want to consider that. But frankly, I don't know enough about the patients that the member is referring to. I don't know enough about their conditions. I would love to have a sit down with the member to discuss this, to see whether or not this is something that would be appropriate. recognizing that we are trying to provide other supports during freeze up and break up. But I'm certainly interested in learning more and having a discussion with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
See. Oral question. Nakita Council Member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, at the moment we have about 10 elders in the community, and of that, 2 or 3 have serious health issues. So would the Minister and his department be willing to, well, if 2 out of those 3 were identified as having serious issues and wanted to go to Inuvik, would the Minister house those elders in Inuvik, whether it's long-term care or other means by that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I said, I know that there are some unique situations in Sigachik, given, like I said, that they don't have an airport, and during freeze up and break up, they're truly isolated. There's no road, there's no airport. I would be happy to sit down with the member, talk about options that we might be able to deploy here. But every situation is going to have to be unique. We have to make sure that, you know, that we can, what level of service we can provide during freeze up and break up to the individual. And if that is something that there is a big concern about an individual and their particular care, I'm open to having this conversation and to try to find some solutions. But until we look at them case by case, I'm not sure what we can do other than explore options. And it may mean bringing somebody in. It may not. It may depend on what we can provide. So I'm happy to have that conversation with the member in order to support the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Can the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March 5th, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute released its report on the state of justice in Canada, with the N.W.T. ranking 12th in the rankings of Canadian jurisdictions. I'd like to ask the Minister of Justice what his comments are on the findings of this report and whether or not he agrees with them. Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have not yet had an opportunity to review the Macdonald-Laurier report, but I think we have been concerned over the last 2 years about some of the methodology. We don't think it in many ways correctly reflected our situation, where we have vast distances and a very small population. I do note that with respect to some of the more objective findings, such as the time required to get to court, we were near the top. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Somewhat unfortunate the minister hasn't had time to look at this report. It was released earlier this month, and I would assume it would be of interest to him and his department. But some of the findings do address what the minister just spoke of. The report mentions that there is the challenges the North face, but we also have the second highest rate of violent crime in Canada and the highest rate of property crime. And the report also found that the N.W.T. spends little on legal aid compared to other jurisdictions. We received an F in support for victims, according to this report, with the lowest proportion of restitution orders in Canada. I'd like to ask the Minister of the state of support programs that support victims in the Northwest Territories, if you could speak to those. Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Victims Services Program is a fundamental component of how we provide support for victims in the Northwest Territories. There are 11 community-based victim services in 8 different communities. They service those communities, and they also travel often with the courts to other communities to assist with victims, not necessarily with the courts. I think they sometimes travel with the courts, but they do act in all the communities, including not only the larger ones. So there's victim assistance coverage for the whole of the Northwest Territories. Admittedly, there are victim assistance workers only in 8 communities, but they do serve the whole of the North. So we are always concerned about these programs. We are always seeking to improve them. I think we've come a long way. Perhaps we have further to go. Thank you.
Merci. Oral question, Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the report also gave the Northwest Territories an F in costs and resources, and found that even though we are the most policed jurisdiction in Canada, that it doesn't, it's an expensive system. The corrections system is also found to be very expensive, and it doesn't seem to be lowering our rates of crime or lowering the amount of people who are incarcerated. So what is the minister doing to address the high cost of our justice system that doesn't seem to be getting us the results moving up the list rather than moving down? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, costs are always a concern, and as I mentioned earlier, one of our problems is that we are serving a vast territory with a very small population. So on a per capita basis, yes, our costs do seem very high. We are always looking at ways to reduce costs and reduce also the amount of criminal activity in the Northwest Territories through such initiatives as DBTO Court, Wellness Courts, and Wellness Court. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Or a question, no data Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I think when reports like this come out, they shake the public's confidence around our justice system. So I'm wondering if the minister can commit to reviewing the report and providing a response, at least around, or some sort of public statement on what he sees as the strength of our system, if he does in fact disagree with these reports. Can he commit to read the report? Thank you.
Minister of Justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I will undertake to read the report, and certainly I would be prepared to answer questions in the future about the report or perhaps make statements with respect to it. I do want to say something about the legal aid system. I was a long time working in that system and spoke often with lawyers from other jurisdictions. They found it to be the gold standard generally of legal aid systems. We had quite a bit of coverage, so there were not people that were unrepresented in court. So I think it's very easy to defend the legal aid system itself. I will look at the report and certainly be happy to answer questions or make statements if required with respect to the findings of the report and our response to those findings. Thank you.
Merci. Or a question, the member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the 2018-2019 main estimates, the Department of Lands plans to roll out several new positions to work on land tenure issues, including land leases in my riding of Decho. So my questions are to the Minister of Lands, and of course my intention is to seek some clarity in terms of how the land lease issues will be addressed. My first question is to the Minister. Can the Minister explain why two positions are going to Fort Smith when there's only 6 land leases in Fort Smith? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Lands.
As members will know, the number of positions for this task of resolving the long-standing issue of equity leases has gone from 3 to 5. The initial training will be in Fort Smith. There's a support staff there that are trained people, both working currently and those that have retired. It was therefore thought that there was would be sensible and most efficacious if there was a group of people working together. Since we do have trained staff there, we thought it best that 2 of the 5 positions would be and remain in Fort Smith. Thank you.
Merci. Or a question, member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could the Minister explain the criteria for selecting these communities? It's clear that the Minister has made a decision for his community of Fort Smith. The other communities, I understand there's other criteria that could be objectively used. One such criteria could be, office space. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned earlier, there are trained people in Fort Smith, plus those that are currently working and those that are retired can assist in training the 5 candidates for these positions. As proposed, we are going to have 2 positions remaining in Fort Smith. 2 of the positions will be in Fort Smith. One will be in Inuvik, one in Yellowknife, and one in either Fort Simpson or Fort Providence. Now, there are many considerations that will have to go into the placement of those positions, whether in Simpson or in Fort Providence, the availability of candidates, office space, and support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada Daya Kasi Member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, would the minister agree that one criteria could be the number of fees that are currently being addressed? Fort Province, for one, has the highest number of land lease, the highest number of land leases. Would the minister agree to have a position situated in Fort Province? Merci.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The review of these leases will, of course, take some time, and I don't think it's necessary that the staff be located in the exact location where the leases exist. So, therefore, we thought it most efficient that there be a team of people put together in Fort Smith. So, there is experienced staff there. As proposed, 2 of the candidates will remain in Fort Smith. The others will be one in Yellowknife, one in Inuvik, and one in either Fort Providence or Fort Simpson. Thank you.
Oral question, no Daya Kasi Member Decho.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the name of efficiency, sometimes small communities are the affected communities because we lose positions to regional centres and headquarters. I'm optimistic that the minister could work with riding, the leadership of my riding community, and would the minister commit to get back to me by May 24th with perhaps a formal decision to ensure that the position is in fact placed in Fort Providence? Masi.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know whether we would be able to identify candidates and resources by May 24th. That's the issue, so I can't make that commitment. Thank you.
Masi. Oral question. Daya Candidate Member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are not enough pilots in Canada to meet the demand, and this gap is widening. The effects are being felt across Canada, but in the N.W.T, we are disproportionately affected, I'd say, because of our territory is so large, we have a lack of road infrastructure, and the new rules around pilot fatigue mean more pilots are required to maintain the current flights that we have. Many residents rely heavily on small regional airlines, and those are the type of airlines that have difficulty retaining pilots because they're being poached by the bigger companies who can offer more. The N.W.T has become sort of a training ground for pilots where young pilots might come in and then leave, so the pilots are also more inexperienced. I've heard that the big companies are hiring entire classes of pilots and the instructors. It doesn't look well for the future. So, and in Hay River, we'd like to see more flights in and out of there so we can get some competition and lower the prices. But this pilot shortage is making that even more difficult. So because the Minister of Education is responsible for labor and training, I have some questions for him. First, I'd like to ask, has the department identified this as an issue? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know when not too long ago when the Yukon government, they looked at creating some type of training school for pilots. The member's correct. We do have a shortage of pilots throughout all of Canada. And when our pilots here in the Northwest Territories are getting approached and by big airlines, that does become a concern for residents, as well as he mentioned, a lot of us are connected by the airlines. We have had initial discussions with one of our airlines here in the north, but that's all it is right now, is just initial discussions on how we can move forward in creating some type of partnership or training for a pilot school here in the Northwest Territories, and we'll continue to keep members updated as this moves on, because I do know that the Yukon has really jumped into this, and we want to follow suit because we do have a very vast region here in the Northwest Territories, and we do need to get to our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akita Daya Kasi Member Hay River North.
Mr. Speaker, that's great to hear. I've got a couple of good answers from the minister today. I was talking to someone yesterday, and one of their relatives wants to go to flight school, but I think it was $90,000 a year. You know, it's pretty cost prohibitive. So I'm glad to see that the department is taking these steps. And I know it's early days, but does the minister have a timeline when we can expect an update on the progress of this? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey, Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned in my earlier response, we just had initial discussions. That's where it is right now. I do believe my colleague, the Minister of Infrastructure, has sent a letter of concern to his federal counterpart about some of these concerns with pilots and concerns that the member has brought up here today. And we will keep members apprised of how this progresses as we have these discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess it is very early, but is this something the government would look at partnering with a local airline on? Is the government willing to look at providing funding to get this school started? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We don't really have the full details in line right now, and as this progresses, as the work progresses with one of these northern airlines, we'll see what kind of response we get back from the federal government. We'll have a better idea of what everybody's role is in this and what our role will be as a government. And until then, we really don't know until we get more details. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Ken, the member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions will be to the Minister of Lands, and it's going to be changed a little bit from what I was looking at doing here. I'm going to come back to what the member from the DHO was talking about, was these positions. So we heard the other side say that we should maybe put the positions in Hay River. Hay River has 6, just like Fort Smith. So can the minister please look at doing this instead of pitting two small communities against each other? Take one position and put it in the date show. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned previously, the plan is to have 5 people in this section or this department dealing with equity leases, 2 in Fort Smith, 1 in Yellowknife, 1 in Nuvik, and 1 in either Fort Simpson or Fort Providence. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akira Dayakasi, member Nehende.
Thank the minister for the non-answer again, but I mean, I understand we got 5 positions. We have 2 in Fort Smith, 6 equity leases in Fort Smith, 6 in Hay River. We have 55 in Fort Providence. 58. 58 in Fort, thank you. 31 or 33 in Nehende, which is in Fort Simpson, that surrounding area. So will the minister get his department to look at it and actually, after doing the training, that's what they're trying to do, that's what bringing all those 5 together, put 1 position in Fort Simpson, 1 position in Fort Smith, 1 position in Fort Providence, 1 in Yellowknife, and 1 in Nuvik. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, this proposal for these 5 positions was thought out over a period of time. And as I say, I don't think it's necessary that the employees, these 5 employees, be in the same community that the leases are located. It's more important that they have surrounding them the correct support, both from current employees and perhaps retired employees, to finally resolve this matter of these long-standing equity leases. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tada Dayakasi, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Support. I agree. I think that's great. We're looking at office space. DHO has an office space with government services there. They have an internet service that's there. Well, you know, internet. They're close to Yellowknife.
Close.
like they're really close. So why won't the minister look at this and be fair to the Decho, the Nahende, and put the positions where they need to be? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, the members may remember that the original proposal was that 3 positions be all in Fort Smith, which seems sensible to me because we have the expertise
Good minister.
So, to be reasonable, we've come up with an alternate proposal to hopefully resolve this long-standing issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. No dere kasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, this is a minister who thought 10% was reasonable when we were talking about leases. Now we've got it down to 5%, which is a little bit more reasonable. When we talk about the date show, Lands Department has Fort Province and Kikisa being serviced out of, guess what? South Slave, the Fort Smith office. So, will the minister look at this and quit worrying about the position in Fort Smith, but look at what to help the residents of the Northwest Territories, i.e. Fort Providence, and are really close to Enterprise, and put the position where it needs to be in Fort Providence? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Lands.
Mr. Speaker, what's most important and should be paramount in our minds is resolving this situation of the long-standing equity leases, which has been a thorn in the side of the residents and the minister for some time. We sought to resolve it in the most efficient way possible. We have agreed, however, that to speed things up, there will be more employees. At least I hope that will be the result of having more employees. But the real point of this is to resolve the matter. And that's what we're proposing to do. I think the proposal, as we've changed it from 3 to 5, and the placement of those employees is a reasonable way of resolving the matter in the most efficient way possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Can the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we began our sitting, I had questions for the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs about changes to the CTV Act, City, Towns and Villages Act. It's the last day of the sitting. We haven't had a bill. Well, perhaps we'll have a bill later, but I don't predict that's going to happen. Where is the minister at with changes to the CTV Act? Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I know that we were trying to get it rushed through. There was concerns with the tourism, the income for the city of Yellowknife, etc. So we have been trying to work diligently on it. We're still on track. We have our legislative proposal that I believe is in the process of being submitted. I know I dated it March 6th, and it was sent out of my office on March 8th, so I can find out where exactly in the background it is, but we are diligently trying to get that legislative proposal to standing committee at this time. Thank you.
Oral question. Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So has the city, at the time of when this issue was first brought to the floor of the House, there was a concern that the city of Yellowknife, who's the community who's been targeted for these changes and who desperately needs them after this government has cut their tourism support. So has the minister reached out to the city of Yellowknife and communicated to them and solicited them for their upcoming budget challenges if this legislation isn't brought forward according to their timelines? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is responsible for the CTV Act. We are not responsible for the funding that is provided to the Visitors Association. So as stated, I can't speak on behalf of another department. I am not sure. I know that Municipal and Community Affairs would not be going into the City of Yellowknife to look at their budget for their Visitor Center. That is not under Municipal and Community Affairs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question. Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was trying to frame the issue, but I'll be more clear on this. Has the department or the minister's office spoken with City Council or City Administration on the proposed changes to the CTV Act, and do they understand that delays in the legislation could result in the City of Yellowknife not being able to meet its budget obligations? Thank you.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, we have been meeting regularly with the City of Yellowknife actually on this act, so I will make sure that they are talked about what our timeline is. We did present it to them when we first provided it, so we are on track with them. I do want to clarify as well, I found out that the legislative proposal is before Standing Committee and it was dated March 8th, as I suspected. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, no data, Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the updates now that the legislative process can continue on. I'm assuming that the minister can assure me that this legislation will come forward in the May-June sitting. Can she do that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
It's our hope, yes.
So thank you, Mr. Speaker. As presented in our original presentation on this act to the Standing Committee, we are still on track with that. So once the Standing Committee reviews the legislative proposal and permits their feedback, then I will give drafting instructions. And if there is no major glitches, then this will continue as provided, and so it will be bringing forward in the May session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to go on to that lease issue because we could be here for another year dealing with it, and we'd like to get it moved forward. So my next question, it is to the Minister of Lands, my next set of questions, and it's a follow-up from not the first set of questions I had for him. When we talk about lands, territorial and commissioner's lands. So it is my understanding the calculations are different for territorial and commissioner's land. Can the minister explain why there's two different calculations? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. They are different, as the member opposite has mentioned, but part of that is for historical reasons. One of them is based on the pre-devolution federal approach to pricing, which we inherited, of course, in 2014, and one is our territorial approach on pricing. The differences in lot pricing have become evident since 2014 and the creation of the Department of Lands. So we are aware of the differences, and hopefully the differences will be less. As members know, we are implementing a $840 minimum so that there will be a similarity between the minimum rates on the leases. Thank you.
Masi. Oral question, Akira Council Member Nahende.
And I thank the minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, is the department looking at harmonizing the commissioner's land and territorial land together? And if so, when? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members will know, the territorial and commissioner's lands are already managed by one department. I had thought initially that we could have one act, but that seemed to be too complicated or too difficult. However, we are hoping to harmonize the two acts, and as I say, we have made the change in the minimum rates, which does harmonize the two acts. Thank you.
Oral question, Tadade Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, if constituents has arrears, and does the department have a plan that can help them get in good standings, or is legal action that is threatening the course, is that still going to be moving forward? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Lands will and does work with lessees who are less than 90 days in arrears. However, once it reaches that point, they can work with the Department of Finance. Thank you. Oh, he's good.
Masi. Oral question, no data, Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. and I thank the Minister for that brief explanation. My next question, Mr. Speaker, is in regards to the residents that are part of the Decho First Nation process or the Acknowledgements First Nations process. Does the Department recognize this and honour it? And if they do, will they remove the threat of legal action until both are resolved? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government of the Northwest Territories and the Department of Lands recognizes and honours the land claim processes of the First Nations of the Northwest Territories. While these negotiations are taking place, the administration and control of land in these areas that aren't federal remains the responsibility of the Government of the Northwest Territories. Further, the Department consults with the Indigenous governments on any land administration actions in accordance with our procedures that respect the interim measures agreements. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is society's eligibility for business incentive policy, BIP. Would the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment please provide the following information? 1, it appears that the business incentive policy is, as it is currently applies, may compromise an incorporate society's right to have all the powers, rights, and immunities vested by the law in a corporation, as provided by Section 4.2 of the Societies Act. Please explain this possible infringement of a legal right by the business incentive policy. 2, some societies carry small business activities, may hold a legitimate business license and meet the requirements of Section 6E of the business incentive policy. Please describe the process for such a society to become a BIP registered. And 3, if the Minister is of the position that societies are not BIP eligible, please provide an option for a policy amended to enable preference for incorporated societies to participate in sections of our economy are often neglected by currently registered small business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Written questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have 5 written questions today for the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment, and they relate specifically to the changes to the Seniors Home Heating Subsidy Program. In the Minister's statement on March 6, 2018, he announced updates and changes to this program, but the guidelines currently published on the Department's website are from June of 2016. Question 1, the Minister announced increases in the income threshold to determine eligibility and the amount of the subsidy. Can the Minister explain the details of the changes in eligibility to the Seniors Home Heating Subsidy? Specifically, how are the income thresholds and income limits going to change? 2, changing to a monetary-based subsidy could conceivably make the value of the subsidy subject to market changes in the price of fuel. Can the Minister explain the rationale for changing to a monetary-based subsidy and how it will avoid a scenario where seniors are exposed to cost fluctuations? Question 3. Under a monetary-based subsidy, the government will provide funding to suppliers of fuels who will track the deliveries to consumers. How will the change to a monetary-based subsidy affect consumers who want to access 2 or 3 types of fuel, such as a homeowner who uses both heating fuel and wood or pellets? Question 4, the level of subsidy is partly determined by a zone system. Can the Minister explain if the zone system for communities has changed and what the rationale was for making this change? Last, the Minister announced that the program will now be extended to renters, not just homeowners. Can the Minister explain how the Seniors Home Heating Subsidy will apply to seniors who rent their homes? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. Speaker, I have returned to written question 6-18-3. asked by the member for Cam Lake on February 23rd to the Minister of Justice regarding land transfers in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Interactivity Transfers Exceeding $250,000, April 1st to December 31st, 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following three documents entitled Northwest Territories Coroner Service 2016 Annual Report, Northwest Territories Power Corporation Capital Adjustments 2017-2018 Budget, and further to my return to written question 6-18 in brackets 3, a document entitled Land Transfers in the Northwest Territories 2010-11 to 2016-2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Communities and Diamonds Social Economic Agreements Annual Report 2017. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following document entitled Follow-up Letter to Oral Question 133-18, bracket 3, Chemotherapy Services at Stanton Hospital. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to table the following document, 2017 Westminster Workshop for Public Accounts and CAPAC Conference. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I give notice that on Friday, May 25th, 2018, I will move the following motion. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that Committee Report 6-18, brackets 3, report on the review of the 2017 report of the Auditor General on Climate Change in the Northwest Territories be received by the Assembly and moved into Committee of the Whole for consideration. And further, notwithstanding Rule 49, that Committee Report 6-18, brackets 3, report on the review of the 2017 report of the Auditor General on Climate Change in the Northwest Territories be moved into Committee of the Whole for consideration today. And Mr. Speaker, at the appropriate time, I will be seeking unanimous consent to deal with this motion today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading and bills. Notices of motion for first reading and bills. Motions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I move, second by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on March 15th, 2018, shall be adjourned until Thursday, May the 24th, 2018. And further, that at any time prior to May the 24th, 2018, if the Speaker is satisfied, after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly, the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment. The Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that date. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order. To the motion. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Motions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent to deal with the motion I gave notice of earlier today.
Member seeking unanimous consent to deal with the motion he gave earlier today. Are there any nays? There are no nays. Member, you may continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River North, that Committee Report 6-18(3) report on the review of the 2017 report of the Auditor General on climate change in the Northwest Territories be received by the Assembly, and further, notwithstanding Rule 49, that Committee Report 6-18(3) report of the review of the 2017 report of the Auditor General on climate change in the Northwest Territories be moved into Committee of the Whole for consideration today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion's in order. To the motion, question? Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Let's see. The report 6-18(3) is now moved to Committee of the Whole. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Bill 12, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures Number 1, 2018-2019, be read for the second time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
You're almost ahead of me there. Motions in order. Motions non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 12 has had its first reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Municipal Community Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that Bill 8, Emergency Management Act, be read for the second time. This bill repeals and replaces a former act and reflects a new emergency management structure consistent with current operational territorial realities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order. To the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 8 has had a second reading, is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Thabetcha, that Bill 12, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures Number 1, 2018-2019, be read for the second time. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes supplementary appropriations for operation expenditures for the Government of the Northwest Territories for the 2018-2019 fiscal year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order. To the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 12 has had a second reading. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole of Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 1-18(3), Minister Statement 19-18(3), with Member Hay River North in a chair.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to consider Committee Report 6-18(3) report on the review of the 2017 report of the Auditor General of Canada on climate change in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Let's get down to it. I'll turn to the Chair of the Standing Committee who considered the report for any opening comments. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, yesterday I reported the bill, and I won't go in at length. It was fairly lengthy yesterday, but I mean the key issue here is climate change has major impacts on the Arctic, and of course, that has huge consequences for our jurisdiction. And Northerners know that the recent years of forest fires and coastal erosion, permafrost erosion, these issues are live issues that affect them, affect their communities, affect their families. And the expectation is that we have a robust framework and mechanism to deal with them. And unfortunately, in previous years, that was not the case. And that is what the Auditor General of Canada found in their audit. Now, the Standing Committee worked very diligently to gather evidence on the Auditor General's reports and looked at those recommendations very closely and spoke with departmental officials and officials from the Office of the Auditor General as well. And this is not an issue about the people who are working at that department. This is an issue, a management issue. And these audits are always management issues. And the committee takes no issue with the hardworking staff at the department or the hardworking staff in the public service in general. This is really about the kind of tools that this government needs to lead on climate change. We want to ensure as a standing committee that those tools are in fact in place and that all parties involved with this audit and the subsequent standing committee review understand quite clearly their roles and responsibilities under the government's commitments to climate change. And we appreciate that much of this work has been identified as ongoing in the government's climate change strategic framework. However, when the committee reviewed those drafts, many of the key findings and recommendations the Auditor General made that were accepted by the department were not clearly included in the climate change strategic framework, and the department has acknowledged that, and I understand they are working to correct that in the final form of this framework. We'll be making a number of recommendations that we'll debate later in these proceedings. But key, I think, is understanding the contents of these recommendations. It's very easy to agree with the findings, but taking meaningful action to ensure that these problems are addressed and do not reemerge, that's the interest of the Standing Committee. It's not about being critical or scoring points. It's about making government better and ensuring that we can tackle the immense challenges that climate change represents to Northerners, to our communities, and to the people we serve. So with that, Mr. Chair, I will conclude my opening comments, but I welcome any other member of the committee who wants to provide some comments that I may have missed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Earlier, the committee agreed to forego opening comments. Does the committee still agree that we shall forego opening comments? Thank you, committee. The way we deal with these reports is we move through each recommendation and treat it as a motion. So we may begin that process now. Mr. Testart? Oh, sorry. One moment. I'll just give committee a moment to orient itself. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources and the Department of Infrastructure take steps necessary to ensure that all 8 recommendations made by the Office of the Auditor General in its report are fully implemented in a timely manner. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There is a motion on the floor to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that in future any Government of the Northwest Territories Department being audited provide the Standing Committee on Government Operations with a copy of its action or implementation plan at the earliest possible opportunity and no later than 3 business days prior to the public review on the Auditor General's report, consistent with the process convention on communications between Cabinet Ministers, Standing Committees, and regular members. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor to the motion. Mr. Testart. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that in future, any N.W.T department selected for an audit provide the Standing Committee on Government Operations with a copy of its action or implementation plan in draft format, and further, that the document not be finalized until the department has had an opportunity to consider the recommendations made as a result of the Standing Committee's review. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There is a motion on the floor to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources acknowledge and reference the Auditor General's report and recommendations in the Climate Change Strategic Framework. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources bring forward a draft climate change strategic framework action plan for the consideration of the Standing Committee no later than May 11th, 2018, which identifies specific activities to be undertaken by the Department in support of the climate change strategic framework and in response to the recommendations of the Auditor General.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There is a motion on the floor to the motion. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I referenced in my opening comments, the committee is aware that the climate change strategic framework is a work in progress and is expected to be completed soon, but one of the concerns of the committee is ensuring that the Auditor General's recommendations are properly addressed therein. In the course of our review, the evidence the evidence that was provided to the committee for consideration was that this framework is going to be how the department addresses the Auditor General's findings, and committee wants to ensure that the specifics of those recommendations are met clearly, and not just by the framework, but by a concrete action plan. So just for clarification, the intention of this motion is to see a concrete action plan that's brought forward that addresses those Auditor General concerns. And this has been something that we have shared with the department during our review of this report in the first place. So committee does not believe that this deadline of May 11th is onerous and is not only that, but achievable and gets at the results that we're looking for, that the audit's findings are properly addressed and result in better accountability and public governance over climate change in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources bring forward a draft Knowledge Agenda Action Plan for the consideration of the Standing Committee no later than May 11th, 2018, which identifies specific activities to be undertaken by the Department in support of a climate change strategic framework and in response to the recommendations of the Auditor General. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources report annually on progress being made to meet the greenhouse gas emissions targets established in the Climate Change Strategic Framework and remain open to the possibility of making target adjustments as required to meet the overall emissions reduction target by 2030. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources, with Cabinet endorsement and participation, hold a ministerial roundtable on climate change in the Northwest Territories as a method for seeking industry input into climate change strategic framework and to secure commitments at the political level that industry will work to meet the targets set in the climate change strategic framework. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. Mr. O'Reilly, to the motion.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I don't want to belabor this, and I'm going to speak to this one and perhaps the next one. During the public hearing that was held on the audit, we heard from ENR staff that there had been one meeting between the departmental staff and representatives of industry. And while that's helpful, I think as we move forward on the issues of energy and climate change, we need to develop more of a partnership approach on this moving forward. And what this recommendation is aimed at is providing some constructive ideas for the ministers and cabinet moving forward on how to meaningfully engage industry moving forward on reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, energy use, and so on. So what we're looking for here is some real leadership from the minister and cabinet on this. Sending staff is okay, but it would be far more meaningful to engage industry by having ministers at the table discussing with industry leaders. So that's what this motion is about, and I look forward to a positive response from our cabinet colleagues moving forward on this. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources give consideration to the development of the following procedural authoritative instruments: a Territorial Climate Change Act, a formal N.W.T climate change policy, memoranda of understanding identifying ministerial and departmental responsibilities for climate change initiatives, and an assessment exercise designed to identify and provide the department with sufficient capacity to fulfill its leadership role. And further, that ENR report back to the committee on its consideration of these recommendations, identifying those procedural authoritative instruments that it will adopt, together with reasons for any decision to not proceed with these instruments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There is a motion on the floor. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, over the course of our review of the Auditor General's findings, the Auditor General was quite clear that authorities were not in place to allow ENR to fulfill its leadership role in the previous greenhouse gas strategy. And some of the items that are contained in this motion are the kind of instruments that were suggested to us as examples by the Auditor General's office as the kind of authoritative instruments that ENR could employ to assist its leadership, to strengthen its leadership role. Over the course of our hearings, this point was somewhat lost, and we wanted to ensure that the committee is very clear in what it is recommending. We appreciate that the Deputy Minister in this case is being very proactive in his role of reaching out to communities, to stakeholders, to other N.W.T departments in the work on climate change, and we appreciate that the Minister responsible sits on a Cabinet committee, and these discussions are ongoing. But the committee wants to ensure that apart from those working relationships, there are clear authoritative instruments that allow the department to be the lead on a whole of government approach to climate change. And what we're proposing, I think, will greatly help the government in its decision making around climate change and ensuring that all departments are working together. And this goes back to a long-standing view of many of the honourable members of this House, that the silos need to come down in the public service and in the government's various departments and public agencies, and we need to find formal ways to work together and also informal ways. I think the N.W.T has developed great informal ways to work together. Now we need to strengthen the formal ways so we can give solid leadership roles to ENR in this case. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. In my first set of comments, I neglected to thank the committee members and the Office of the Auditor General. In fact, the Auditor General himself came to Yellowknife for the hearing, and there was a lot of hard work that was put into this report by the committee, and I sincerely thank them and thank them for the opportunity to participate in their review of the report. I just want to make sure that my cabinet colleagues focus on the report. This is the most important recommendation that comes out of this whole exercise, and it's about leadership. And when we heard, you know, the audit, and I'm just going to quote one sentence from the audit itself, says, overall, we found that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources did not fulfill its leadership role and meet its commitments on climate change. That's a pretty serious finding. So now, when we heard from the department, the minister, the deputy minister on this, they did provide us with a draft action plan in response to the audit findings. And on this particular item around leadership, the idea was that there would be a assistant deputy minister's climate change committee set up, or well, actually it's been in operation since 2016, but there was really no other ideas in here, even from the discussion that was held about how to make sure that the proper authority and structure is in place to make sure that we can do the work that's required on climate change. So the committee heard, you know, from the department, from the minister, the deputy minister, and we've looked at the climate change strategic framework. There was no ideas about how to make sure the proper authorities in place, the proper structures are in place to make sure that we achieve those greenhouse gas reductions that are required as part of the international and national obligations that this government has signed on to. That the leadership structure is just not there from what the committee heard. So committee did some thinking around this. We've made some suggestions about how to make sure that the proper authority and structures are in place to make sure that we can deliver on those commitments. That's what this recommendation is about. A Climate Change Act, formalizing the roles and responsibilities is one way to do it. A cabinet-approved policy is another option. Making sure that climate change is incorporated into the way that cabinet submissions are prepared, financial management board decisions are made. Those are some other ways to ensure that we are able to deliver on the climate change commitments that we have agreed to as a government. So this is, as I said, the most important recommendation coming out of the entire report to make sure that we can succeed at the end of the day. So I really urge our cabinet colleagues to focus on this one in particular. There's some good ideas here, and I look forward to a positive response from our cabinet colleagues moving forward so that we can all share in the success of making sure that we achieve our climate change objectives, policies, targets, and move forward together and benefit all the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favour? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Mr. Chair, I move that this Assembly recommends that the Department of Environment and Natural Resources identify in its own climate change strategic framework action plan specific measures that will be undertaken with associated timelines to fulfill the wildlife management actions recommended by the Office of the Auditor General, including the development of an inventory of commitments already identified as important to addressing climate change impacts on wildlife with a view to ensuring those commitments are met. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is another area that the committee found the department had agreed with the Auditor General's finding that there were significant issues with the management of wildlife species identified at risk, and that there was a piecemeal approach where certain species were prioritized over others, and there are statutory obligations for protection of all species at risk. And although the department agreed with the Auditor General's finding, their response was largely to maintain the status quo as to how they've been managing these resources. And although committee appreciates that there are limited resources available to any branch of this government, there are statutory obligations in place to protect these species. And at the end of the day, our role in this audit process is to ensure that the obligations the government sets for itself are in fact being met. And this recommendation is largely designed to address those concerns, as our evidence found that the department's response to date has not been satisfactory in directly and effectively responding to the Auditor General's findings. So I'll conclude there, Mr. Chair, but I hope that we develop a more systemic approach or systematic approach to protecting species at risk in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that this Assembly recommends that the Government of the Northwest Territories provide a response to this report within 120 days. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. There's a motion on the floor. The motion is in order. To the motion. Minister McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I was actually waiting for the last motion. I had a few comments, but I thought I'd wait till the last motion. And we appreciate the work that committee does. We don't always necessarily agree with some of the findings of the Auditor General's report. However, we did incorporate a number of their recommendations into the draft framework. Committee is aware of the work that we're doing because one of the things I've tried to do is to keep committee apprised as to all the work that we're doing. There was a motion there on the knowledge agenda action plan. That is currently under development and will be ready for review by the end of summer. The Auditor General themselves did acknowledge to ENR that departmental work being done on the department of the draft climate change strategic framework, and they would not document the work completed as the framework was a draft document and was not finalized in 2017, therefore could not be included in the report. And I think we all recognize that, and they admitted that we were doing some work, and they weren't. That was not going to be included into the Auditor General's report. Our folks have been working hard trying to get this out. We recognize the importance of this more so than anybody else. They're writing about it. I'm actually living it. And so we know that it needs to be addressed. There was a comment on silos. This is the one issue where I don't believe we're working in silos. We can't, not on something as important as this. And so we're working closely with the other departments in coming up with a plan that I think is going to be a good one. My understanding is they've done all jurisdictions. The Auditor General has done all jurisdictions, and none of them are shining knights. Every one of them has some issues, and we've taken the Auditor General's recommendations seriously. I don't take it as gospel, but we're taking it seriously. And there was one other comment that I had here. But again, we appreciate the work that's done. I just don't want people out in the public that are watching to get the impression, based on the committee report and the Auditor General's recommendations, that we've done absolutely nothing. That's the farthest thing from the truth, and I take exception to that. Not on my behalf, but on behalf of the people that are putting all the good work in. To say that we're not fulfilling our goal. I've heard some other comments about maybe they're not resourced enough. I think we heard that as we went through the business plan. Maybe that's something we have to visit. I can assure you, though, that our work is being done. It will be done well. I would have been criticized had we gotten out too early, because you would have said, well, it's too quick. You got to have some work being done. Our plan is to have the document out, tabled in May-June session. We've got the whole summer to do the last round of consultations, and then we will table the action plan in the October session. And as I always do, I will work with committee and give them a briefing before we actually table it, so they are aware of what's coming down the pipe. Now, I will stop there, Mr. Chair, because I can see that we've got a few members that want to contradict everything I've just said. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister. I gave you a wide berth because you did hold your comments to the end, but generally we speak to the motion. So, to the motion that is in front of us. To the motion, Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to reiterate that the committee did not find, or is not putting forward this report, of which is asking for a response in 120 days for the purpose of criticizing the hard work of staff who are working at the Department of ENR or the Department of Infrastructure who are subject to this audit. The committee's intention is to provide constructive feedback on the response to the Auditor General's report and the findings of the Auditor General report, and to present the evidence that we heard in our hearings. That is the contents of this document, and I believe, and I know that the committee feels very strongly that this issue is important, and I know the minister does as well. And we look forward to working with the minister to find a way that we can improve on our responses to climate change. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Committee, do you agree that we have concluded consideration of Committee Report 6-18(3, Standing Committee on Government Operations, Report on the Review of the 2017 Report of the Auditor General of Canada on Climate Change in the Northwest Territories? Thank you, committee. This concludes our consideration of Committee Report 6-18(3. What's the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that Chairman rise and report progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Committee Report 6-18(3, Report on the Review of the 2017 Report of the Auditor General on Climate Change in the Northwest Territories, with 11 motions being adopted, and would like to report progress, and that consideration of Committee Report 6-18(3 is concluded. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Mussey. Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. Motions in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Mussey. Third reading of bills. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Yellowknife South, that Bill 12, Supplementary Appropriation Act, Operation Expenditures Number 1, 2018-2019, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I would request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Member requested a recorded vote. Motions in order. To the motion. Questions been called. All those in favor, please stand.
Member for Nuvik Twin Lakes. Member for Hay River South. Member for Tabacha. Member for Hay River North. The member for Mackenzie Delta. The member for Yellowknife North. The member for Cam Lake. The member for Tunade-Weladay. The member for Nahende. The member for Frame Lake. The member for Decho. the member for Nunakput, the member for Nunavut Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 16 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Bill 12 has now had a third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, will you ascertain if the Commissioner of Northwest Territories, the Honorable Margaret Tom, is willing to enter the chamber and to assent to bills?
Please be seated. Mr. Speaker, members of the Legislative Assembly, good afternoon. I look forward to attending the 2018 Arctic Winter Games in Hay River and Fort Smith next week. I am already so proud of our team, N.W.T, athletes and coaches, and how they have performed during their trials to qualify in their respective events. And in how I know they will conduct themselves with respect and good sportsmanship as representatives and ambassadors for the Northwest Territories. I would also like to extend a huge message show and acknowledge the dedicated volunteers, coaches, parents, and families who have all worked so hard to support our N.W.T athletes and to make these games the huge success that I'm sure they will be. I would like to wish good luck and safe travels to all of our athletes as they compete at the Arctic Winter Games, and I will be one of their best cheerleaders. Now, as Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, I am pleased to assent to the following bills. Bill 10, Supplementary Appropriation Act, bracket Infrastructure Expenditures, bracket number 4, 2017-2018. Bill 11, Supplementary Appropriation Act, brackets Appropriation Expenditures, bracket number 4, 2017-2018. Bill 12, Supplementary Appropriation Act, bracket appropriation expenditures, bracket number 1, 2018-2019. Thank you. Kwanani, merci beaucoup, Masicho Juan.
That's the job that I had the least to do.
Please be seated. Colleagues, before we adjourn today, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of those pages who have been with us during this session. Our youth are our greatest resource. It's always a pleasure to have them in our chamber. I also like to take this moment to remind our young people of the Northwest Territories that Legislative Assembly will be hosting our next Youth Parliament from May 14th to 18th of this year. This is a great opportunity for grade 9 and grade 10 students in the Northwest Territories to assume the role of their MLA at the Legislative Assembly here in Yellowknife. The deadline for application is April 6th, so you still have time to apply. For more information, please visit the Legislative Assembly website or contact our public affairs team. Colleagues, please join me in thanking the interpreters who have been with us throughout the session. They are Meryl Sumberg, Sarah Clary, Susie Napayak, short, Tom Anka, Margaret McKenzie, Ruth Carroll, David Black, and Lillian Elias. Thank you for their service that they provide for us and for making us use our language as part of the official language. I'd like to say a big merci to them as well. I would also like to extend a special thank you to Emily Dorian. Ms. Dorian joined us from the table at Legislative Assembly of Prince Edward Island, where she serves as a clerk assistant and has spent the past 3 weeks learning about our unique form of consensus-style government and a leading hand in our clerk's office and committee and in this chamber. Merci, Emily, for your assistance has been greatly appreciated by everybody that's here in this building, and you will always be welcome at this table. Merci. And colleagues, finally, I'd like to thank all of you for your continued hard work and the dedication to this House and all the people of Northwest Territories. I also wish you a safe travels as you return to your constituencies, your communities. This House will not sit again until May. However, I know that you will all be busy on the ongoing business of government, the committees, and the needs of your constituencies. Although we will all be busy, I remind members to take time to reach out to your constituencies, your family, your community members, and hear their concerns, their issues, and to reconnect with the family and friends, and to enjoy the beauty that surrounds us each day, such as today. We are blessed to live in such a beautiful territory. With that, Mr. Clerk, orders of the day. Madam Clerk.
Orders of the day for Thursday, May 24th, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. Prayers, minister statements, member statements, return to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration in committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Minister Statement 1-18.3. Minister Statement 19-18.3. Report of committee of the whole. Third reading of bills. Orders of the day.
You've done this before. Madam Clerk. This House stands adjourned till Thursday, May 24, 2018, 1:30 p.m.
Order.